On April 9th, 1942, after months of brutal fighting in the Philippines, American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula were finally forced to surrender to the Imperial Japanese Army. Exhausted, starving, and ravaged by disease, more than 70,000 prisoners of war were taken into custody. With little preparation and even less regard for their condition, the captives were then ordered to march north deep into Japanese-controlled territory. The journey that followed would become one of the most infamous war crimes of the Second World War. It would be so horrifying that it would come to be known as the Bataan Death March. So as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Long before the United States entered World War II, the Philippines already held enormous importance in the growing conflict in the Pacific. At the time, the islands were in American possession and their location made them strategically valuable. Sitting along key routes in Southeast Asia, the Philippines gave the United States a foothold in the Western Pacific and a position to project power across the region. And recognizing the importance of defending the islands, the US began strengthening its military presence there in the months before the war. In July of 1941, the U.S. Army created the United States Army Forces in the Far East, often referred to as USAFE for short. The organization brought together American troops stationed in the Philippines with the forces of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, and the result was a force made up of roughly 120,000 men. Most of these soldiers were from the Philippines, many of whom had only recently been mobilized and had limited military training. American units formed a much smaller portion of the force but provided much of the leadership and organization. The two groups were expected to work together to defend the islands if war ever broke out in the Pacific. As this was going on, Japanese leaders were closely watching developments in the region. For them, the Philippines represented both an obstacle and an opportunity. As long as American forces remained there, they were a potential threat to Japan's plans for expansion across Southeast Asia. Capturing the islands would remove that threat and give Japan far greater control over vital shipping lanes in the Pacific. By the middle of 1941, both sides understood that if war did indeed come to the Pacific, the Philippines would almost certainly become one of the first and most important battlegrounds. And within a matter of months, that prediction would prove tragically accurate. As 1941 was nearing a close, the fragile peace that existed between the US and Japan was quickly unraveling. Tensions between the two nations had been building for years as Japan expanded its influence across Asia, but the situation reached a breaking point as the year was nearing its close. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched the infamous surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The strike damaged much of the US Pacific Fleet and pulled America directly into the war. But while the attack on Pearl Harbor is often remembered as the opening act of the conflict in the Pacific, it was only one part of a much larger Japanese offensive that was unfolding across the region. Almost immediately after the attack in Hawaii, Japanese forces began hitting strategic targets throughout Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. And as you might have guessed, the Philippines was one of the country's primary objectives. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft began striking American airfields and military installations in the Philippines. These sudden attacks destroyed many of the aircraft on the ground and weakened USAFE forces before the main invasion even began. And soon afterward, Japanese ground forces started landing on various parts of the islands. One of the most significant of these landings occurred on December 22, 1941, when the main body of General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army came ashore on the island of Luzon. The Allied troops attempted to resist the landing, but by the end of the day, Japanese forces had secured key positions and were preparing to push inland. As they continued to push south across the island, their advance was unfolding faster than many leaders had expected. Further complicating things was that the strategy that was adopted before the war was deemed no longer suitable. For years leading up to this point, the American military had developed a defensive strategy known as War Plan Orange 3 or WPO3. The plan was based on the assumption that if Japan invaded the Philippines, the defending forces would not attempt to hold the entire archipelago. Instead, they would withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and the nearby island fortress of Corregidor. From those positions, they would block access to Manila Bay and hold out until reinforcements could arrive. However, when American General Douglas MacArthur returned to active duty shortly before the war in 1941 to oversee the defense of the Philippines, he viewed that plan as overly cautious. So rather than preparing for a withdrawal to Bataan, he favored a strategy that attempted to defend the islands more broadly along their coastlines. The goal was to challenge the Japanese landings directly and prevent their forces from becoming established on land. This ended up being a mistake. Once the invasion began, it became clear that the situation was changing too quickly for that approach to succeed, and they struggled to slow the Japanese down. On December 23rd, so just one day after landing, MacArthur was informed that holding the beaches was no longer possible and permission was requested to pull forces back. At that point, MacArthur made the decision to abandon his coastal defense plan and return to the earlier strategy outlined in WPO3. Orders were then issued for American and Filipino forces to begin withdrawing toward the Bataan Peninsula, which was considered the most defensible position remaining. This rugged strip of land on the western side of Luzon had long been viewed that way. Surrounded by water on three sides and connected to the rest of the island by a narrow stretch of land, Bataan offered natural advantages that could help slow the Japanese advance. As the retreat began, the Philippines' capital, Manila, was declared an open city. This meant that the military openly stated that the area would not be defended, and this was to prevent it from being attacked and civilians from being killed. Government officials and military headquarters were then moved to Corregidor, while troops across Luzon continued to fall back toward Bataan. The peninsula would soon become the final defensive line for the Allied forces in the Philippines. The Battle of Bataan formally began on January 4th, 1942. The fighting that followed dragged on for more than 3 months, and during that time, the soldiers defending the peninsula faced a growing list of hardships. The withdrawal to Bataan happened so quickly that large stockpiles had been left elsewhere on the island. As a result, the troops stationed on the peninsula soon found themselves surviving on sharply reduced rations. Some soldiers were limited to half or even a quarter of the food they would have normally received. Disease also began spreading through the ranks. Combined with the overcrowded conditions and the limited medical supplies, the tropical environment allowed illnesses like malaria and dysentery to spread quickly among the USAFI. Medical personnel did what they could to treat the sick, but they often had little equipment and almost no medicine to work with. Despite those challenges though, the American and Filipino troops continued to resist the Japanese advance. Week after week, they held their lines on Bataan, hoping that relief might arrive, but as the months passed, it became clear that help was not coming. By the beginning of April of 1942, the situation on Bataan had hit a wall. After more than 3 months of fighting under increasingly desperate conditions, the defenders of the peninsula were no longer capable of continuing the battle. Thousands of soldiers were sick or weakened by starvation, and many of the units that remained were barely able to function. Major General Edward P. King Jr., who commanded the forces on Bataan, understood the situation was becoming hopeless and faced a difficult decision. His superior officers had instructed him to continue resisting for as long as possible, but he knew that further fighting would result in the unnecessary deaths of thousands of men who were already too weak to defend themselves. After weighing the situation, he met with the representatives of the Japanese 14th Army on April 9, 1942, and formally surrendered. The decision effectively ended the long battle for the peninsula and brought the resistance there to a close. The surrender also left upwards of 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers in Japanese custody, and that number was far greater than Japanese commanders had anticipated. Japanese officers now faced the challenge of moving this massive group away from the battlefield. And with limited transportation available and preparations for the prisoners poorly organized, the solution they chose would lead to one of the most notorious events of the Pacific War. In the hours after the surrender, the defeated USAFI soldiers were gathered together in several locations across the southern end of the Bataan Peninsula, particularly near the towns of Mariveles and Bagak. Many of the men there were exhausted and confused. After months of fighting, the war had suddenly ended for them, but what came next was far from certain. Japanese guards began organizing the prisoners and quickly ordered them to surrender whatever belongings they still had. Personal items were taken, pockets were emptied, and valuables were effectively stolen. Needless to say, the process was far from orderly. In some places, the captives were assembled in fields where Japanese soldiers conducted rough searches of their clothing and gear. The guards also appeared especially interested in anything that might have originally belonged to Japanese troops. Rumors quickly spread among the prisoners that anyone found carrying Japanese money or souvenirs could be accused of taking them from dead soldiers on the battlefield, and these fears turned out to be justified. In one instant, a small group of prisoners was taken aside and ended after guards discovered items believed to have been taken from Japanese troops. Word of this spread rapidly, and many prisoners immediately began hiding or discarding anything that might attract suspicion. The searches themselves also turned violent at times. Some prisoners were savaged in the process, while others were robbed of whatever valuables they still carried. In a particularly brutal case, a guard attempted to remove a ring from a prisoner's finger. When he was unable to pull it free, he apparently used a blade to take it instead. For the newly captured soldiers, these early encounters made it clear that surrender had not brought safety. Instead, they had entered a new and uncertain phase of the ordeal that would soon force them onto the road for a journey many of them would not survive. The next day, the prisoners were ordered to begin moving north. Their destination would eventually be Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training facility located many miles away. The first group of prisoners started marching out of the town of Mariveles on April 10th, while the others began leaving from Bagac the following day. From there, the different columns of prisoners gradually merged as they moved north through the peninsula toward the town of Pilar before continuing toward a rail station at San Fernando. The prisoners were organized into groups of about 100 men, and each group was assigned to several Japanese guards who were responsible for keeping them moving. For the men forced onto the road, the march began under extremely difficult conditions. Again, many of them had spent months fighting on reduced rations, and disease had already weakened large numbers of soldiers. Many were barely able to stand, let alone walk what would be about 65 miles or 105 kilometers to Camp O'Donnell. During these early stages of the march, there were occasional moments when some Japanese officers showed small acts of kindness. Some prisoners later recalled instances where guards allowed them to keep certain personal belongings or shared small amounts of food or cigarettes. In one unusual case, a prisoner who had been a well-known football player at Notre Dame had his class ring taken by a guard, only to have it returned later by a Japanese officer who recognized him from his college playing days. Those moments, however, were unfortunately rare and short-lived. As the columns of prisoners moved farther along the road, the treatment they received would steadily grow harsher. Japanese guards drove the prisoners forward with little concern for their condition. Anyone who slowed the pace risked being struck with rifle butts or attacked with whatever the guards had at hand. In some cases, prisoners who stumbled or fell were simply left behind. Others were finished by bayonets or with bullets where they lay. One particular form of punishment that prisoners later described was known as the sun treatment. This is where guards force groups of captives to sit or kneel for long periods of time in the open under the intense tropical sun. They also weren't allowed to wear helmets or cover their heads, and many were already badly dehydrated. Sometimes this would take place within sight of fresh drinking water that would seem so close yet couldn't be further away. Other times, men who simply asked for water were sometimes killed, and the goal of this exercise, it seemed, was to exhaust the prisoners before forcing them back onto the road. As you might imagine, water quickly became one of the most desperate needs for the marching soldiers, thanks in large part to the sun treatment. Streams, pumps, and wells occasionally appeared along the route, but the prisoners were usually prevented from approaching them. Some of the men tried to break ranks and reach the water anyway, only to be attacked or killed by the guards. A few of the soldiers drank from muddy puddles along the roadside, despite knowing the water might carry disease. Filipino citizens living along the road also sometimes tried to help by offering food or water to passing prisoners, but their acts of compassion came with enormous risk. If guards saw a civilian assisting a prisoner, both of them could be taken out on the spot. Not everyone died immediately from the treatment, but the long hours of marching in the heat steadily drained the strength of the men. In some cases, trucks following the columns drove over prisoners who could no longer move, while at other times, guards or cleanup squads finished them off. For the thousands of men struggling northward, the road seemed endless, and with each mile, the number of prisoners able to continue the journey grew smaller. After days of marching under these conditions, the surviving prisoners eventually reached the town of San Fernando. For many of them, their arrival might have seemed like the end of their ordeal, but in reality, it was only the next stage of it. At the San Fernando rail station, the prisoners were forced into freight cars for the transport further north. These rail cars were old metal boxcars that were originally built decades earlier and were never intended to carry large numbers of people. Each one had been built to hold around 40 men at most, but the guards packed more than 100 prisoners into many of the cars. Once the doors were closed, the conditions inside quickly became unbearable. There was almost no ventilation, and the tropical heat built rapidly. With so many men packed together, there was no room to sit or even shift positions. The prisoners were forced to stand, pressed tightly against one another as the train slowly made its way north. There were also no bathrooms on any of the boxcars, so the men had no choice but to relieve themselves where they stood. As the hours passed, the air inside the boxcars became thick and suffocating. Some prisoners lost consciousness from the heat and poor airflow, but there was no space for them to fall, so they remained wedged upright among the others. The train journey stretched from early in the day until late in the afternoon, and by the time the doors were finally opened again, many of the men inside the boxcars had died. Those who survived the rail journey were forced out of the cars near the town of Capas, but even then, the ordeal was not over. The prisoners still had one more stretch of road ahead of them before they would reach the place where the Japanese intended to hold them. Despite their further weakened and worn conditions from the train ride, the survivors were ordered to continue marching. The final leg of the journey required them to walk roughly 9 more miles, or 14.5 kilometers, to Camp O'Donnell. When the prisoners began arriving at the camp, though, new problems became immediately apparent. Thousands of exhausted and sick men were crowded into an area that had very little infrastructure to support them. Mirroring their earlier conditions during the battle, food was scarce and clean water, which was desperately needed, was extremely limited. Medical care, which was also desperately needed, was almost non-existent. Disease continued through the overcrowded camp as dysentery, malaria, and other illnesses continued to ravage the soldiers. Japanese guards provided almost no medical assistance, leaving American and Filipino medical personnel to care for the sick with whatever limited supplies they could find. Doctors and medics tried to treat the wounded and dying, but they had almost nothing to work with. As a result, the death toll inside Camp O'Donnell rose quickly. During some periods, hundreds of prisoners were dying each day. Many of the dead were buried in large graves dug just beyond the barbed wire surrounding the camp. Of the 78,000 or so prisoners who had begun the march weeks earlier, only about 54,000 of them eventually reached the camp. The others had died along the road, in the rail cars, during the final stretch of the journey, or after arriving at Camp O'Donnell. For a long time, the full story of what happened on the Bataan Peninsula remained largely unknown to the American public. News from the Philippines had been limited after the loss of the battle, and many of the details about the fate of the captured soldiers did not emerge until much later in the war. It wasn't until January 27, 1944, that the US government publicly revealed the details of what became known as the Bataan Death March. The information came from sworn statements given by the American officers who had managed to escape Japanese captivity and make their way back to Allied lines. Their testimony described the brutal treatment prisoners had endured during the march and in the camps that followed. Shortly afterward, the story reached a wider audience when the accounts were published in a feature article in Life magazine. For many Americans reading the reports, the descriptions of attacks, executions, sickness, and starvation were shocking. These revelations quickly fueled anger toward the Japanese and strengthened public support for continuing the war effort. By the point the news broke, the war in the Pacific had already begun to shift in favor of the Allies. American forces were advancing across the Pacific and slowly pushing Japanese forces back toward their home islands. The Philippines, in fact, would eventually become the site of one of the war's major turning points. In October of 1944, American forces returned to the islands during a massive amphibious assault. From there, Allied troops continued the campaign to reclaim the rest of the archipelago, and in January of 1945, American and Filipino forces recaptured the Bataan Peninsula. Not long after, the fighting moved toward Manila, which was finally liberated in early March after a brutal battle through the city. For many who remember the suffering of the prisoners from Bataan, it was seen as a form of long-awaited justice. After the war ended in 1945, Allied authorities began investigating reports of atrocities committed by Japanese forces during the conflict. The events surrounding the Bataan Death March quickly became one of the most serious cases under review. In September of that year, Masaharu, the commander of the Japanese 14th Army during the campaign in the Philippines, was taken into custody by Allied forces. He was then formally charged with multiple counts of war crimes related to the abuse and death of prisoners during and after the march. In February of 1946, a military commission found Masaharu guilty and he was sentenced to firing squad, which took place that April outside Manila. For a long time, there was little official acknowledgement from Japan regarding what happened, but that changed in September of 2010 when a small group of American prisoners were flown to Japan to receive an official apology for their treatment. While this came nearly 70 years after the war, the gesture was seen as an important step toward recognizing the hardships faced by prisoners during the conflict and honoring those who didn't survive the march. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.